Sue Frantz, a first-generation college student, earned her bachelor's in psychology from Indiana University in Pennsylvania in 1989, and then a master's degree in social psychology from the University of Kansas in 1992. She began her teaching career as an adjunct professor at community colleges in Kansas City, where she developed a passion for introducing psychology to diverse students, especially through Introduction to Psychology courses. Sue is a faculty emerita at Highline College in Des Moines, Washington, where she taught for over 20 years, and she is an affiliate faculty member at New Mexico State University. She has played a significant role in the national psychology teaching community, serving on the executive committee for the Society for the Teaching of Psychology for 8 years, including a term as president in 2019. She also contributed to scoring advanced placement exams in psychology for 15 years. Sue's teaching excellence has been recognized with multiple awards, including the New Mexico State University Alamogordo's Teaching Excellence Award in 1998, Washington State's Anna Sue McNeil Assessment Teaching and Learning Award in 2011, as well as the APA's inaugural Excellence in the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning at a 2-year college or campus award in 2013. Later, she went on to earn the prestigious Charles L. Brewer Teaching Award in 2016. Sue co-authored Principles of Social Psychology 3.0 with Charles Stanger and Teaching Psychology, a Step-by-Step Guide, 3rd edition with Douglas Bernstein and Stephen Chu. It is my pleasure to welcome Sue Frantz to the couch. Sue, welcome to the couch. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Jason. I appreciate the invitation.
I think I should explain for my listeners how you and I became acquainted. I'm not so sure you became acquainted with me. I think I became acquainted with you first. Most of my listeners are interested in psychology. They don't necessarily have a background, or formally at least, but they're interested, or they just like me enough to tune in. And anyone who knows me or has listened to the podcast any number of episodes knows that my love, my career, the air I breathe is psychology. I love studying it. I love reading about it. I love interviewing people who love it as much as I do. And I love trying to implement it in my life whenever and wherever possible. And so Sue, for those of you who are wondering how we met, is an acquaintance of mine through a Society for the Teaching of Psychology website. And I've been kind of stalking her for the past year. Anything and everything related to the teaching of psychology, Sue Frantz is tagged in, or she's the author of, or someone is saying you should ask this person. You seem to be a master teacher. Many of your colleagues tell me that you are the person that I have to interview if I want to talk about psychology, what good teaching looks like. So I wanted to let my audience know that you and I have never officially met. This is our first time, but I have so much respect for what you do, Sue, and I have so much respect for the people who tell me you're the person to talk to. So this is kind of, I guess, 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, professional psychology style. I'm sure as we get to know each other, maybe right here on this podcast today, we're going to probably learn just how many people, just how many professionals we have in common. Always interesting to learn how people form these professional relationships. And speaking of, Sue, could you introduce yourself maybe a little more formally to the listeners and tell us a bit about your background and your journey in psychology?
Sure. Let's see. I was born in a little town in Western Pennsylvania, population 200, and I guess there are 199 there now because I left.
Right.
I always did well in school, and neither of my parents finished high school. But I always did well in school, so I hung out with the other kids who did well in school, took the classes that they took. And my senior year of high school, sitting in a physics class in the fall, the teacher asked how many of us were planning on going to college. Every hand went up except for mine. I had never considered it. So all my friends are looking at me and they're like, come on, you're going to college. So up my hand went. And with that, I was going to college. And I went where a lot of my friends went. Indiana University of Pennsylvania is about 2 hours away. Excellent state school. And people ask me, why did you major in psychology? I have no earthly idea.
Wow.
I I truly don't. I can make something up.
Yeah.
Could be true, may not be true. I don't know. I know I was not interested in being a therapist though. My very first semester of college, professor take an intro psych, and the professor said, if you are interested in being a psychology major and you do not want to be a therapist, there are lots of other possibilities. And I remember being very relieved. Great, I don't have to be a therapist. I don't know what the other options are. There wasn't any discussion of
Yeah.
that at the time. It was just, you don't have to be a therapist. So I major in psychology. I end up working with a social psychologist on a couple independent projects. And he said, you should go to graduate school in social psych. Okay, so I'll go do that. So you can see that I haven't put a whole lot of thought into planning my future. This was just people telling me what to do and me saying, okay.
Yeah.
So I applied to several graduate programs in social psych. I got offers from two. One would be a focus on psych and law. The other would be a focus on psychology and the media. And I took the psych and law option at the University of Kansas. So I go to Kansas for graduate school. It was a PhD program. The person I was going to work with, it ended up not working out. I ended up working with somebody else, ends up not being psychology and law. So I complete my master's degree. And by that point, I was pretty burned out
Hmm.
and I needed a break. This gets us to one of your questions, which you have not asked yet,
Yeah.
which is what's up with me not having a PhD?
Yes, I was going to ask you that question, maybe a little more gently. I was going to say your career at Sue is incredibly impressive to me, or probably anyone who has looked or followed you at all. You've had a significant impact on both psychology and teaching. Many people assume that you have a PhD, I'm sure, because that's the standard path to success in the field, right? And I was going to say, yeah, could you share your educational journey? Tell me what's up. Why not the PhD?
So, University of Kansas social psych program awarded the master's
Mm-hmm.
along the way. So I took the master's and I said, okay, I need a year off. I had to do something.
Sure.
So that first summer, I drove airport shuttle between Lawrence and the Kansas City airport,
Putting that
which
psych
was a
degree
lot
to
of fun.
use. Yep.
Yep. Yeah, it was a lot of fun. Didn't pay very much, but it was a lot of fun. And I thought, well, I got to do something else.
Mm-hmm.
So, well, I guess I've got a master's degree. Maybe the local community college would hire me to teach part time.
Okay.
So I went to Johnson County Community College and I said, hey, you got any courses? Would you be interested? And the guy who headed up the social science
Mm-hmm.
division, he was just so excited to have somebody in psychology who was not clinical or counseling.
Bet.
So he hires me. And as a graduate student at the University of Kansas, I was the teaching assistant,
Mm-hmm.
and I had my own classes, and they just didn't do anything for me. There were some challenges. Anyway, I thought, well, this teaching thing probably isn't really for me.
Mm.
I stepped into that community college classroom. It was an evening class. And for anybody who's taught at community colleges, particularly in the evening, that's a very different student population,
Yeah, different
a much
challenges.
older,
Sure.
yeah, much older population. So I walk in, I'm in my mid 20s, early to mid 20s, and average age of the class is probably over 35 and much more ethnically diverse than what I had at Kansas. And I totally fell in love with it. It was a blast. I learned so much from those students. And I had gone in thinking, okay, I got to be this authoritative figure.
Yes.
And when I saw the students, I'm like, okay, that's not going to work. So I reframed it and I said, okay, I know the science. You all have the experiences. Let's merge them together and see what we get.
Yeah.
So I learned a lot from them. I still use examples from the students I had in that class and the classes that followed.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, okay, well, this is a lot of fun. Um, if community colleges will hire me with this master's degree, do I really need to go back and spend the money that frankly I didn't have
Mm-hmm.
and the time and the aggravation to earn the PhD? So I taught part-time the rest of that year. The next year I spent applying for full-time jobs, and my first full-time teaching job was at a 2-year branch of New Mexico State University in Alamogordo.
So yeah, that's a pretty big job, right? Going to from community college to a 2-year, I guess R2. Was that an R2 institution or still a?
I don't know if they were an R2 at the time. I think they are an R2
Okay,
now, but
yeah,
they're striving to be R1. But
sure.
it's a 2-year branch, so it's
Hmm.
really a community college
Yeah,
just under the auspices
of the
of the main
university. Hmm.
campus.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think you may have answered this already, but my next question was going to ask you about why you love psychology. Since the theme and maybe the title of this podcast is For the Love of Psychology, I think I've settled on that. I was going to ask what initially drew you to psychology. I think I've heard you say that, but what is it that sort of sustained you all of these years and made you maybe fall in love and continue to love it? I can only assume that you still love it.
Yeah, you're right. I do.
Yeah,
I do. And I think that comes across in all the things that I do. Psychology is a user's manual for being human.
yeah,
And who doesn't enjoy learning about themselves? And ultimately, that's what that's about.
yeah,
So we want to know why we think and do what we do. And we also, maybe more importantly, want to know why other people think and do as they do.
yeah.
So, yeah, wherever there are people, there's psychology.
Right. Yeah, it's a way of feeding that sort of curiosity that I think we all have, at least early on, that innate curiosity to know why. And maybe some of us either didn't have it smashed out of us when we were kids, or perhaps even better, we were reinforced for that curiosity. And I'm very similar. My path was very similar to yours, just hearing you talk about it. Constantly asking questions as a kid, and that just continued. My curiosity just continued, and it was fed in a more deep and meaningful and human way in psychology.
You made it to your junior year. Think about how you did that. Everyone in this room has a chance to graduate. For some, you'll be the first in your family, the first with a choice to go to college.
So, Sue, yeah, you're right. Your passion for psychology should be obvious to anyone who knows you. And honestly, just accepting the offer to come on my show and talk about your love of psychology tells me that you are in this maybe for the long haul, right? I would assume that you consider yourself a lifelong psychology person, a lifelong learner.
My identity is certainly that of a psychology professor
Hmm.
and everything that entails, both the teaching of psychology and the continuing to learn about psychology.
Hearing you describe your road to where you have come, I heard you say right from the outset when you started teaching, you recognized that maybe being that sage on the stage and going in and doing things in that community college one way wasn't going to work. Given the diverse population, especially age, you were clearly mature beyond your years, Sue. It seems to me that you were pretty self-reflective and you recognized that you had to approach it from a collaborative perspective. I'm wondering what kind of advice might you give to someone who's considering a career in teaching, particularly psychology?
Well, the first thing anybody who's considering a teaching job do is surround yourself with other instructors, both in the discipline and outside of the discipline, and ask questions often. So often we think that if we ask a question, it means that we're revealing that we're incompetent. Well, here's some news. If you're not super experienced in something, you are incompetent. And that's okay. That is perfectly fine. So within the realm of psychology, we got some places. So you mentioned the Society for the Teaching of Psychology has a Facebook group. So tremendous place. People are always asking questions there about pedagogy, about psychology. Um, there's also the Society for the Teaching of Psychology also has a psych teacher listserv for those who are not on Facebook.
Hmm.
So it's for those who aren't familiar with listservs, that's some old technology
Yeah,
right
yeah.
there. You send an email to one address, it goes out to everybody who is subscribed, and people can then reply, and it goes out to everybody who is
Hmm.
subscribed. So One of the first psychology communities that I joined was in 1993, I think. It was a listserv, and I forget who started it, but it was TIPS, Teaching in the Psychological Sciences.
Mm-hmm.
And some of my closest friends came out of that group. And that group was a lifeline for me. I was adjuncting at the time in the Kansas City area and got my first full-time job in Alamogordo in 1994. And I was the psychology department. Actually, I was for a short time both the psychology and the sociology. So here I am in my mid-20s, brand new psychology professor, and I'm teaching intro psych, which, if you want to get into it, it is the hardest course that we have on our curriculum to
It's the
teach.
hardest thing I've ever loved.
So yeah, I'm desperate for help here. So that listserv was a lifeline. The people who were part of that were just a lifeline for me. So surround yourself with fellow teachers. I do also recommend joining the Society for the Teaching of Psychology. You get a whole bunch of benefits with that, including the Teaching of Psychology Journal, which comes out quarterly.
Yep, and can do that as a student, right?
Yeah, as a
Hey,
student.
you don't have to be a professor. You don't have to have a master's degree to join. In fact, you might
Nope.
even get a little discount. I may be ahead of myself here, but I'm pretty sure there's a discount for students, right?
There is a discount for students.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're dollars, and the student rate I think is going to be $20.
I mean, you can't even get lunch for two for that, ladies and gentlemen. And we're not here to plug the Society for the Teaching of Psychology, but I know that we both have an affinity for it. You have been connected so long. And the fact that you have been around in psychology for as long as you have speaks, I think, largely to you, but also I think to the field itself. You know, people talk about things changing, things growing, things developing, things evolving. Tell me about some of the more significant things you've noticed that have changed throughout your long and storied career. Like, has there been an evolution of psychology in general, but maybe the teaching of psychology in particular?
The biggest change, I would say, is that psychology departments, particularly at the big universities, have decided that undergraduate education is worth caring about. When I started back in the 90s, it was pretty much the graduate students were teaching the undergraduate courses with a handful of exceptions for upper division courses. It's essentially saying we're going to take our least experienced instructors and let them take care of the undergraduates. What we've seen in the last 30 years is that a lot of those big universities now have faculty who are specifically designated as teaching faculty.
Mm-hmm.
They're not expected to do research. They're expected to teach undergraduates, and in many cases to teach graduate students how to teach undergraduates. Intro Psych is our most important course in psychology, hands down, no question. Very few of our people who are taking intro psych are psychology majors, probably about 5%. The other 95% are majoring in something else. This is probably going to be the only psychology course that they take. And we need to, as instructors, give some serious consideration as to what they need to know. I frame it in my own mind as what my neighbors need to know. In some of the communities that I've lived, a lot of my neighbors had bachelor's degrees. And if they had a bachelor degree, chances were pretty good that they also had taken intro psych. They're police officers, they're librarians, they're middle school teachers, they're computer programmers. What do all of these people need to know really about psychology?
It's not true that humans only use 10% of our brains. No study has ever shown or even claimed that. It's just something people say for no reason.
I've been harping on this for quite a while, Jason. About 1.5 million students take intro psych in the US every year. This is our chance. This is our chance to tell them what psychology can do. And for people who are researchers, for the psychological scientists who are doing research, a lot of their funding, grant funding, is coming from government grants.
Yes.
Well, you want the government to to fund your research, you got to convince the politicians and their staffers as to why your research is so important. And why not start with the intro psych class? Because that's where those politicians are right now. Our future politicians are sitting in that intro psych class.
Or the kids of the politicians, right?
More immediately.
Mhm.
And the staffers who are brand new out of college, who are working on Capitol Hill, they had intro psych a year or two earlier. If we can communicate to them why it is so important, then everybody knows why it's so important. So I think that's one place where we could see some growth. Intro psych is our PR program, frankly. And of course, it's not just politicians and grant money. It's how can psychology help businesses be more humane to their employees, to retain employees? How can engineering groups use engineering psychology to design objects to work better with how humans work? The whole field of human-computer interface is all psychology. Not all psychology.
Yeah.
There's a heavy psychology component to human-computer interaction.
Yes, certainly there's more than just clinical and counseling psychology.
Indeed.
And so we want to share those opportunities and share those interfaces and share those interdisciplinary opportunities for students coming in. I know they love to talk about careers in psychology. And to your point earlier, you said that you were surprised to hear there are other things you could do. You didn't know what they were, but there were other things that you could do besides just clinical or counseling. My students today in 2024, probably yours as well, they know that there are other things, but I don't think they realize that there's so many other things you can do with a psych background, right? I think counseling and clinical psych make up maybe 30%, a third total. So there's so many other things you can do. Sue, we talk often about psychology being so important. It's one of the most popular courses, particularly introductory course at any major university, maybe behind business, nursing sometimes. I don't think we need to belabor the point that psychology is the best discipline out there, right? But what do you think is the second best? What is the second most interesting field of science to you personally?
I'm going to go with biology,
Okay.
particularly anatomy and physiology. I think of psychology as being volume 1 of the Human User's Manual, and anatomy and physiology is volume 2.
Well, that kind of dovetails with my next question. I was going to ask, if it weren't psychology that you fell in love with so long ago, what do you think you would have done with your life? So assuming it was academics, would it be biology, do you think?
Probably not biology.
Okay.
Math or chemistry. I had a great experience with math. I had in middle school and high school female math teachers.
Wow.
I never got the message that math was not for girls.
So no stereotype threat there for you.
None at all.
That's awesome.
And I absolutely fell in love with math as a college student. I took calculus as an elective. And it was my math GRE scores that got me into graduate school. So so probably math, although I really enjoyed chemistry. High school chemistry was fantastic. In fact, when I got to college, even though I had declared psychology as my major, I thought, chemistry was a lot of fun. Here, let me take this college chemistry class and let me explore that. And it just bored me to tears. And I think it had more to do with the instructor than it did with the course content, which was certainly enlightening for me. And I've always kept that in mind.
That is awesome, to hear you say that biology you were interested in, you ultimately went the psychology route. Students, even to this day, tell me sometimes when they ask me about majoring in psychology, and I say, well, you really need a lab science. I'd recommend biology or chemistry for your 2-sequence lab science. They'll say, oh, gosh, that sounds scary. I thought psychology would be easier. Psychology doesn't have all that math or science. And I'm like, oh, yeah, but I mean, psychology is changing, right? We do care about evidence. We want to make sure you become a good consumer of research, can communicate things empirically. You do have to know things about the human body, the brain in particular. Nothing really makes sense in the field of psychology if you don't look at the brain. So, Sue, just to transition a little bit, you've taught two, maybe even three generations of students like myself. And we hear a lot of discussion lately, especially about generational differences. I think about the work of Jean Twenge, and more recently, she and Jonathan Haidt pointing out just how miserable the Z generation have become. I want to know if you've noticed any of these changes over the generations. Do you see or have you seen in the classroom a distinction between, say, a millennial and a Gen Zer? Or do you think that's just a lot to do mostly about nothing?
A few years ago, I read a book that has nothing to do with psychology. It was called Capturing Music: The Story of Notation. It's the history of musical notation. I am not a musician, but I was fascinated. Like, well, sure, it developed somehow. How did that happen? It's a fantastic book. Highly recommend it. But in that book, the author included an image of a piece of sheet music. And the caption said that the composer was in this music complaining about how traditional education was going downhill. Kids these days. That piece of music was published around 1250.
Oh my goodness.
We have a long history of complaining about generations, kids these days. So it's always in vogue for older generations to complain about younger generations, and for younger generations to complain about older generations. It's just what we do.
Yeah.
Nobody had it as hard as us. Nobody
Mhm.
has it as hard as us. Well, yeah, it might look different, but nobody's had it easy. So no, much was made several years ago about digital natives. Okay, instructors, here you are, you went through college using a typewriter, and now here are these digital natives with their fancy phones and their ease with technology. I never fully bought into that, frankly, because we know how to use the technology that we know how to use. And my favorite story was an instructor who had a student in class, and beginning of class, and the instructor says, okay, time to turn in this assignment. This tells you how long ago it was. It was before everything was turned in digitally. So the instructor says, time to turn in your assignment. And a student says, oh, I forgot to do it. And the instructor says, well, next time put it on your calendar.
Mm.
And the student says, I don't have a calendar. And the instructor picked up the student's iPhone that was sitting right in front of them, tapped on calendar, and the student just looked amazed. Whoa, I have a calendar. So here's this digital native who I'm sure felt perfectly comfortable downloading music, who didn't know how to use these same tools for academic purposes. So I've never been fully on board with the whole digital native thing, and discussion around that seems to have largely died out. I don't know if we're just so far past that we're all fairly digitally competent that that discussion has largely disappeared. I do think there is one difference right now. It's not generational, that a lot of instructors and students are managing, trying to cope with, and that's the aftermath of COVID and the lockdown. I think it really had an impact on student schemas for what happens in a high school classroom, what happens in a college classroom. And college instructors now are reporting that they're having to talk about things and answer questions that they didn't have to before. For instance, a student asked, how many times can we take the final?
Yes.
Well, once. When will we be able to work on this project in class? Well, you're not. You're working on it outside of class. I'm going to be turning in assignments late. Okay, well, just so you understand, you can't. Or here are the penalties for that.
Sure.
Deadlines really mean deadlines.
Yes.
And I'm also hearing from graduate faculty who are primarily responsible for graduate students that they don't seem to be quite grasping the importance of deadlines. That this really has to be done at this time. You know, you're defending your thesis here in a week or a month, and you're not quite finished with it yet. You have still a lot of revisions to do. The faculty seem to be more frustrated by the deadlines and more worried about the deadlines than the students are. I think during COVID, the COVID lockdown, when we were all trying to be more accommodating,
More flexible, yeah.
Yeah, I think we're
Compassion.
starting compassion,
Yeah.
right? Yeah,
How do you put
everyone's
that
got lots
genie
of
back in the bottle? How do you give them a little less rope now?
and
And
some
I'm
instructors are reporting that we're starting to slide out of that,
Mhm.
but it's going to be a little while yet.
Yeah, it seems to me it's going to take a while. I still have students that send me doctor's notes saying that they're COVID positive. So every time you think we're kind of over the hump and that's not going to be an issue this semester, you realize, wow, it's not gone. It's endemic now, I guess, and it's probably going to be around like the seasonal flu. It can't shut things down forever. And I think that's really where the rub is for me in particular is how do I continue being compassionate but at the same time sort of maintain some institutional and educational integrity here because at the end of the day I still want my students to learn, I still want them to mature, I still want them to develop some grit, right? I mean, I'm not completely sold on the idea that hard work wins the day, but you do have to have some level of resilience.
One of the many concerns about artificial intelligence is its potential to help students cheat. But can it fool a teacher? NBC News digital reporter Andrew Stern put his old high school teacher to the test with surprising results.
This is something I know the students are talking about. It's something faculty are talking about.
AI, as you know, has become a hot topic and becoming even more so, particularly things like ChatGPT. What are your thoughts on its potential impact on education in general and psychology in particular? Do you see AI as this menacing threat, right? The sky's falling, or do you see it as this incredible new opportunity, sort of opening to a new frontier, or maybe a mix of both?
So here's another story. Charles Lindbergh was 25 years old in 1927 when he flew solo across the Atlantic. And he comes back to the States and he spends a year hopping from small town to big town to small town, giving the same speech over and over again. And he's promoting the incredible thing that is flight. And in that talk, he said he could envision a time when as many as 15 people would fly in a plane. Here is this visionary, and he's picturing 15 people in a plane. Lindbergh was 66 years old in 1968 when he visited the night before with the Apollo 8 crew before they flew to the moon. A few weeks later, the first Boeing 747 flew.
Wow.
And then about a year after that, the first commercial flight took off, 1970, with 335 passengers and 20 crew. Lindbergh was 67. So in this 40-year time span, we went from Lindbergh envisioning a time when as many as 15 people would fly to a time when 335 plus 20 crew flew. It was at that point when I heard that story that I threw up my hands and said, I cannot predict where technology is going to go.
Or how
Cannot
it's going to be
done.
used, right?
Or how it's going to be used.
Yeah.
So I don't think, so having said that, doesn't going to keep me from guessing. Okay,
Yeah.
I take it back. I'm going to make some guesses.
Yeah.
I don't think that AI is really any different than any other game-changing tech tool that we've experienced.
Google or anything else before that, right?
GPS changed how it is that we navigate in the world. Calculators changed how we interact with math. I think, I don't know this for sure, but I would guess that all the math teachers of a generation older than us are laughing hysterically right now.
Yeah. We've been there.
Because exactly. Yeah, when calculators became so ubiquitous,
Yes.
it was, okay, we got to completely change how we teach math, how we test on math.
Mhm.
And I think AI has done the same thing to writing. Word processors changed how we write. Texting changed how we communicate with other people. The internet changed how we learn new information. We've been all these places before. And so AI is changing how we write and how we interact with each other and how we learn new information. So right now we're in this awkward adolescent stage with AI
Mhm.
as it tells us how much glue we should put in our pizza sauce. So we're still learning what this tool can do, how we can best use it, how we can help students use it. And ultimately, I think that's what that is we're all going to have to figure out best uses for AI and then how to teach students how to do that. Just like we did with the internet, we had to teach students how to evaluate sources. We're going to have to do the same thing with AI. As with those other tools that I mentioned, we can't turn off our brains. If we just rely on GPS and Google Maps to give us directions, we end up driving off boat ramps and into lakes. So we can't turn off our brains. Even when using a calculator or a spreadsheet, we have to have some idea what the numbers are going to be in the end.
Yes.
We just can't blindly put in data and then have it spit out without thinking about, wait, is that right? Did I get the formula right? Did I input the right numbers? That our brains have to be engaged.
Yeah, it sounds
I
like
had
you view it similar to me. I like to think that technology, and I always have thought about it this way since my undergraduate, is that technology has to be an extension of me and what my needs are. I can't be an extension of it. I'm not using it just because it's there, right? I'm talk about that adolescent stage. I'm not doing it just because it's in vogue. I'm going to do it to the extent that I think it makes things more efficient, that it at least gives me the same accuracy, if not better. It's going to, again, make my life better in some way and make the ease with which I give certain information away better versus, I'm just going to use this as a substitute for thinking, or I'm going to use this as a substitute for doing. Sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah, I don't disagree with any of
Yeah.
that. That if we ask AI a question
Hmm.
and it spits something out, I think we have to evaluate AI's sources, just as we did if we hear somebody else tell us a story. So you want to fact check me on Charles Lindbergh? By all means, please go do that.
Right.
It's pretty easy to do, thanks to the internet.
Yeah.
You could probably even ask AI if I got it right, but you better check AI's sources to make sure that those are legit sources.
Yeah.
So I think that's the challenge for us right now as instructors, is that AI has evolved so fast in such a short period of time that we're all scrambling, just like all those math instructors did a few decades ago. What do you do with a calculator?
Well, speaking of things that are not always as they seem, there's a lot of myths that have circulated surrounding psychology. I wonder if you could share one of your favorite myths that is absolutely a myth. No two ways about it. And then after that, could you share a myth that you think might actually be true? Or at least there's a semblance of truth in it.
Okay. Doug Bernstein and colleagues published in 2023 an article in the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning in Psychology titled Misconceptions About Psychology After Taking Intro Psych. 14 instructors at 8 institutions asked a total of 933 students, which of these myths, and they gave them something like 40 or 50 myths,
Sure.
do you think are true? Which do you think are false? How confident are you? And the number one that was endorsed by 94% of students: subliminal messages can be successfully used to persuade consumers to purchase products.
Wow.
Now, I have to put an asterisk on that because I am not convinced that most of the students who answered that question knew what was meant by subliminal messages.
Right. Maybe they were thinking non-conscious or
Non-conscious. Yeah. So that's going to be my one where I think there's some truth to it,
Mhm.
only because the students misunderstood, I think,
Right.
and that they were thinking non-conscious influences. And we know that there are a boatload of
Right.
non-conscious
But if we explain the difference, if we started with that, explain the difference, between non-conscious and subliminal, yes.
Yeah. So for your listeners,
Mhm.
I think that's a whole other podcast
Yeah,
just on subliminal and non-conscious.
sure.
The number 2 item on their list that was endorsed by 87% of students was students learn best when they are taught in ways that match their personal
Learning styles. Yeah. And
That
here we
one
are
will-
thinking it was going to be the 10% of the brain myth, but learning styles, yeah. Talk about that one a little, Sue.
Yeah, I was going to say 10% of the brain.
Mm-hmm.
And when I looked at the data from that research article, that one was only endorsed by about a third of the students.
I guess we've made some headway on that one.
I think we've got that one under control.
Mm-hmm.
That one's a pretty easy one to address in class. I just asked my students if we went in and took out 90% of your brain, would that be okay?
Yeah.
Strangely, they're not okay with that.
No. Or if you received an injury to a part of the brain, a serious injury, right? And you were really, really concerned about your loved one, and you went into the hospital and you talked with the neurosurgeon. The neurosurgeon says, "Oh, what are you in such a tussle about?" It hit the 90% of the brain that he doesn't use, right? It just wouldn't happen. I can't take credit for that one. One of my professors in undergraduate shared that one with me, and it stuck.
That is awesome. I'm gonna put that in my arsenal.
You are welcome to steal that one. And so back to the learning styles.
Learning styles. Yeah, the evidence just isn't there. We certainly have preferences, but does it have any impact if it matches?
And is it possible that
No.
people, again, there needs to be clarification on learning style versus cognitive style, right? And Dr. Bjork, UCLA, has talked about for many, many years. And also to your point, do we need to sort of elucidate this distinction between a learning style and a learning preference? All of us have preferences. Now, by the way, for my audience, and I think Sue here will agree with me, just because you have a preference as to how you think you best learn, or how you think you best remember, or how you think you would best like for information to be delivered to you, doesn't mean that it is the most productive, that it is the most valid way of doing it, right? Like, if you give me a preference, I prefer to be in a hot tub with lots of cold alcoholic beverages around me while I'm reading, my textbooks. But as it turns out, my brain's probably not going to hang on to or do anything, super good with that information if I'm in that context. Preferences.
That's where we should, Jason. That's where we should be recording this podcast.
100%. In fact, before I joined you this morning, I was out in my backyard with a consultant from a pool company talking about exactly what I want them to do when they break ground, hopefully here in September. So I'm working towards that true dream backyard that every retiree should aspire to.
So I'm thinking next March,
Mm-hmm.
I come to your place and we record from
The
from
hot
the
tub.
pool, from the hot tub.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I've got some portable devices that I just purchased so that I could go out on the road and do this very same thing. So I'm all for that. Absolutely. Maybe I can bring back a handful of my guests over this past year, and we can come together and have a little powwow, right? Maybe start at one of my local breweries here, getting some good brew fare, and then head to my backyard and hang out in the hot tub. It's a great idea.
That's some high quality podcasting right there.
I think so. I think it would do well. Yeah, we'll definitely have to make it audio only though, because I mean,
sure, no, absolutely.
Don't want to
No,
endorse
nobody-
any particular drinks, any particular adult drinks. I mean, I
no,
guess unless
no.
someone can pay us to market those.
Okay, well now you're thinking.
Yeah, exactly.
We're off topic, but
I'm
you're thinking.
But yeah, I am thinking about. Well, you got to give psychology away, and I mean, it's not going to pay itself. Certainly, you didn't get into this for the money. I know you said that when you were doing the driving, right, the airport shuttle or whatever, you didn't earn a lot of money. I'm guessing that your quality of life didn't improve that much when you went into teaching. Unless you guys are doing better out in Washington and New Mexico than we are in North Carolina. It wouldn't be hard.
Oh, I was going to say we kind of are.
Yeah, you probably are.
But I think one last thought on the learning styles, which I think is sort of a little bit ironic, is that the advice that's given to K-12 teachers about learning styles, and that's largely where this is coming from, is coming out of educational psychology, school psychology. There are plenty of people in that field who are trying to reverse this trend, but I hear from K-12 instructors all the time about having in-house professional development on learning styles.
It dies hard. It's also in communication departments, by the way.
Oh, yeah, I can see that. The funny thing about it, though, is that a lot of the advice that's given is deliver content in multiple modalities, which, as it turns out, is beneficial to learning.
Yes.
It's just not that visual is good for this person and auditory
Right.
is good for this person. It's that all of that is good for all of us because as you know, Jason, the more ways we can get information in, the stronger the connections that are
Absolutely.
made.
Absolutely.
So it's good. So it ends up being good. The end result is good. It's just the reason why it's effective isn't quite right.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm hoping to have Dr. Gurung and maybe a couple others who are interested in these kinds of matters, learning and memory, on the podcast in an upcoming episode. Stephen Chow as well.
Mhm.
So I want to ask if there are any sort of approaches that you have taken or that you recommend taking that are maybe counterintuitive, maybe just separate from the whole sage on the stage idea. Like for me, I don't flip the classroom per se, but what I do, I said do, is I ask my students, I challenge them to flip ideas on their head. I ask them to apply different perspectives to things just as a way of generating new questions, maybe as a way of just kind of get the juices flowing. I don't mean to say I'm an iconoclast by any means, but I think the status quo for me and certainly for my students sometimes is a little boring. And if I can't spark them, if I can't get them moving, then I don't know. I don't feel like I'm really doing everything I can. So I guess my question would be, what role, if any, thing does or did outside of the box or playing things differently sort of play in your life as a teacher?
I'd heard Eric Landrum at Boise State speak a number of times, and at the time he was the talk he was primarily giving was about what do our students need to know in the context of skills. What skills do they need? And he made an excellent point, which is that the one skill that college students get really good at by the time they earn a degree is the one skill that no employer wants. And that's how to take multiple choice tests. I had to hear that talk about 4 times before
Really
I
sunk
was
in.
ready to make the move. Yeah, well, it sunk in, but am I ready to make the move, to
Yeah,
make the
yeah.
leap, to get rid of multiple choice? I wasn't quite.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, I was also doing some reading about inner teaching. Brian Seville had published a little piece in the APS magazine, the Association for Psychological Science magazine, on inner teaching.
Mm-hmm.
And those 2 things came together and I said, okay, I'm gonna make the leap. So I'll explain how I applied inner teaching in my context. It's sort of a modified inner teaching approach.
Okay.
And at the time, I was not quite ready to get rid of the multiple choice exams. That was too scary. So in inner teaching,
Why do you think that is, by the way, for you at least? Why was it scary? You'd put so much time, put so much of yourself in that, so much confidence in these multiple choice questions. You've probably done the item analysis, right? Like most of us.
yeah,
You're like, I know what a good
Yeah, I
multiple choice
was,
question looks like.
yeah, I was, and that was my primary assessment. My students were doing some smaller
Mhm.
writing assignments that added to that. But what I had in my head, my schema
Mhm.
for what college is, how you assess in college is students come in, they sit down, and they fill in
Yep,
bubbles.
they bubble those answers in.
That's what it was. And for me to step back and go, well, wait, I'm the one who is in charge of this class.
Mhm.
I'm the one who is in charge of what the assessments are going to be. I'm the one trying to figure out what my students know.
Yeah,
And is that the best way? Is that the only way to do
only
it?
way, yeah.
So I decide, okay, I'm going to go ahead and make the leap. I'm going to try this other way of teaching. So I come in, I lecture on the content, students go, they learn this stuff, they study it on their own, they come in, they take the multiple choice test, rinse and repeat.
Yeah.
And as you might imagine, Jason, my classes were and still are very interactive.
Mhm.
So students were asking questions and we were having discussions and, but it was still
Yeah, it was fine.
primarily, yeah.
You
Me
can still
primarily
get the
lecturing.
engagement. Yeah.
Yeah. So I decided, okay, I'm going to try this inner teaching thing. So in inner teaching, you give students a bunch of questions in advance before they read the book. They read the chapter and with the goal of answering those questions. And my questions are short essays. They're often very applied. In some cases, it's here, read this newspaper article,
Mhm.
New York Times article,
Yeah.
and what does that have to do with the concepts that we're talking about in this chapter? The
Yeah.
questions are much better than that, but
Yeah,
you get
yeah,
the
yeah.
idea.
Get the point. Yeah. You're not asking them to go out
So
and read
this,
academic journals, right? This is
correct, correct.
Yeah.
Yep. So the students read these questions, they read the chapter, they answer the questions, type out their answers, and they come to class. First thing they do is get into small groups, 3 to 5, and they talk about their answers. And their goal is to figure out what they know and what they don't know. So, Jason, if you and I are in a class, in a group, you would say, "Okay, I don't quite understand question 1." And I would say, "Well, here's my understanding. I felt like I got this pretty good. Here, let me explain to you how I saw it, and here's how I answered the question." At which point you're like, "Oh, yeah, okay. I get it. I get
Mhm,
it. That
mhm.
makes sense." And then I say, "Question 5, however, I was at a complete loss." And you would say, "Okay, question 5 I get."
Yeah.
And you explain it to me. And then we get to question 7 and we're both looking at each other like, "Yeah, no idea what this is."
Mhm.
So, you tell me as the instructor, "All right, Professor Frantz, could you talk about question 7,
Yes.
9, and if we have time, question 2?"
Mhm,
Those are the
mhm.
ones that we are the most baffled by.
Yes.
And Jason says, "Okay, I think I understand that question, but I'm not totally sold that Sue's explanation really works for me.
Yes.
So can you talk about that too?"
Mhm, mhm.
So I'm getting this information from all of these students around the class, and so maybe the first half hour of class is that kind of discussion. Second half
Kinda
hour of
crowdsourcing,
class,
if you will, yeah.
exactly. Because the idea is that if students already really understand this
Would you
concept,
wanna spend that much time on it anyway, right?
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. I mean, we have a textbook, and
Yeah.
there's a reason we have a textbook.
Well, I remember when I first started teaching, it was just as you said. I go in, I give a lecture, sometimes a very prepared lecture. PowerPoints, a couple years after I started my career, it was PowerPoints. Before that, it was just an outline on the board. But at any rate, I remember feeling like I was up against a tide. I would start going to these conferences, particularly these teaching conferences. I'd have all these great ideas. I'd go back to my institution and try to implement them. And I would feel like I was up against a wall. I would feel like I was undermined because there were so many older faculty there that were doing it the way you should. And their idea was that if you do it any other way, it's really not real. You're not delivering science. You can't trust that students are going to work on their own. You can't give them half the class to just think, pair, and share, as it were. What knowledge do they have? You've got to be there. And I will say, after joining people who are a part of teaching organizations, particularly those that are a bit older and more experienced, so that they can provide the social proof I needed to be like, hey, wait a minute. It's not just these young men and women who are saying we need to flip the classroom. We need to empower our students. We need to be more collaborative in the classroom. We need to be more of a guide or a facilitator in their learning. There are some veteran teachers in these organizations that also agree that this is a good way of doing it. And they also are aware of the research that supports it. So they can give me the arguments. They can point me in the right direction of the empirical research that suggests, no, what I'm doing actually is not a ruse. It's not an illusion. It's not a cop-out. I'm actually still doing the work. It just may look different than the way you're used to doing it.
It is my belief that storytelling can be used in the classroom to promote innovation, integration, and education in every classroom, no matter what subject it is that you're teaching.
Has that been your
illusion-
experience? Or have people
I don't know if
typically?
it's so much generational.
Mhm.
I had interactions with some graduate students recently who are stuck in that model of I have to cover the content. And in their mind, covering the content means lecturing on the content. I think that's the illusion, that if we say it, students will know it.
Mhm.
And what those of us who are veterans in teaching and learning will say is, no, what you say, frankly, doesn't much matter. What you're measuring is what's come out the other side.
Yeah.
If students are understanding the contents,
Mm-hmm.
that's what's most important.
Yeah. Yeah.
So just because you stand up there and say it, no, there's
Yeah.
no guarantee.
Yeah. The
that
outcome
students
matters, right? My last
The outcome
podcast, I'm not sure if you're aware, I did one on busyness, and I wanted to point out this sort of illusion about being busy and being productive, right? And I think maybe that's where some of that came from, for me at least, when I started teaching, was that, well, if I'm up there lecturing for an hour, 3 days a week, 4 classes a week, then I can prove to myself my worth. I'm busy, therefore I'm being productive. And if I'm being productive, anyone, even an administrator who walks by, can see that I'm worth my salt, worth the investment they gave me. They selected the right person, or they made the right hire. But anymore, as I think about busyness in the way that many knowledge workers are now starting to think about it, we realize, wait a minute, you're trying to fit a square peg in a round hole. That the way we measure outcomes might need different kinds of measures when it comes to sort of student learning outcomes, right? Or when it comes to professor productivity or professor worth outcomes. How do you know I'm a good professor? It's more than just how often I talk. It's more than just how many chapters in the textbook, right, that I can cover in X number of weeks. Yeah. But that's a hard sell, I guess, particularly if you're just starting out.
And I think that's why, so many thoughts there.
Yeah.
I really love that discussion of busyness.
Mm-hmm.
It's the illusion that we're doing something. I love that.
Yeah.
The thing that I find, maybe this harkens back to the importance of psychology and what people need to know. What we know about learning has to do with what's going on in here, going on in the learner's brain, and that's the most important part. I've got a little soapbox where I complain about the concept of active learning. The idea that, okay, if students are doing
moving
something,
and doing, yeah,
then they're learning. Well, no, we got plenty of instructors have plenty of examples where they had a great demonstration and students missed the concept.
Sure.
So I had a couple colleagues here in Alamogordo, New Mexico, back in the 90s. One was a fantastic leader of discussions. He never lectured. It was always leading the discussion, and he was a master at it. The other professor in the department hated discussions. In fact, he didn't even take questions from students because he said, you never know what they're going to ask. But he was a master storyteller. He would sit, and he wasn't even up moving about. He would sit behind a desk, and he would tell this story that would go from beginning to end in this 1 hour class period. And he was an absolute master at it. Students were riveted. And I think about TED Talks. A good TED Talk, 17 minutes. There is no active learning stuff going on, but we're riveted.
Yeah.
We are right there. So excellent lecturers are absolutely needed. I don't like this idea of, okay, if you're lecturing, then sort of the flip side of the coin.
Right.
We don't want to go all the other direction, that lecturing is evil. It's if you can engage students to think about what it is they're learning, about what you're talking about the concepts in the book, whatever. If the students are mentally engaged and wrestling with that content, they're learning. And that's what's most important. And there are many ways that an instructor can get students there.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I will admit I am still very much a lecturer at heart. But like you, I'm going to reflect and slow down and give more time with my rhetorical questions to give people time to marinate on and to perhaps construct their own questions. I try to incorporate storytelling when I can into my lectures. And that does, like you, I had a history professor, friend, mentor, who's now passed away. He died last December, actually. Rest in peace, Bob Brennan. But he taught me a lot about how effective you can be just sitting down in front of a class and telling a good story. He was such a great narrator of history, and rarely ever used tests, certainly no multiple choice test. but just a real master of that. And I try to keep that in mind, that it's more than just standing up there and just reading your notes or regurgitating something you memorize, right? You still have to put it together, contextualize it, wrap it up, give students opportunities to interact. Well, I guess right on the heels of that, as we, approach an hour here, Sue, this has been a wonderful talk. I really am glad that you joined us today to share your love of psychology. And I have a couple more questions if you've got time for them.
I've got time.
Who is someone in the field that you really admire? It can be past or present. Maybe someone whose work or their style or influenced you.
Well, not so much in terms of teaching, but in terms of content. The person that I am just absolutely fascinated with right now is Lillian Gilbreth. Lillian Gilbreth, she and her husband Frank were early, what we would now call engineering psychologists or human factors psychologists.
Mm-hmm.
They worked in the early 1900s, and they became known for their time and motion studies. And I promise this is all relevant. They became known for their time and motion studies. They would be hired by companies to come in and use this newfangled technology called film, and they would record people as they worked. And they would take that film back and they would look for ways to make the job more efficient. And
Ergonomics, I guess they used to call this.
Yep. Ergonomics, industrial organizational psychology,
yeah.
they were at the forefront of all of this. So they're doing all of this. And one place where they were, and I just learned about this, one place where they were asked to come in and do this evaluation was hospital operating rooms.
Oh, wow.
Because the surgeons, as they discovered in their research, the surgeons were spending way more time digging around for instruments.
Moving about,
because
yeah.
the instruments were just, thrown down someplace. So they're digging around for what they need, and we're spending less time on the surgery, which meant people were spending more time under anesthesia, which we know the longer you're under anesthesia, the greater the problem. Anyway, so
that's why I can't get things done around the house. I'm going to have to share the story with my wife. I'm too busy looking for the right tools.
So here's what your wife can do for you, which is what they recommend, what the Gilbreths recommended, which was to take all of these instruments, put them on a tray in a standardized way. So the instruments are always laid out in the same pattern, and a nurse or other assistant hands the instrument to the surgeon.
And they're responsible for getting it back in the right place, aren't they?
Well, so the surgeon uses it,
Yeah.
and then, tosses it wherever it is they toss it.
Yeah.
But it's there, the surgeon can stay focused on the surgery rather than digging around for instruments.
That's something.
And in that way, it greatly sped up how long surgeries took. So anytime that you have seen, I keep thinking about MASH, but which
Good
says
one.
more about how old I am
that was
than
a good
anything
one.
else. But yeah, anytime you see on television, in a movie, a surgeon asks for an instrument, somebody hands it over, that's all Gilbreths.
How about that?
Frank and Lillian. Okay, so 1924, Frank suddenly dies. I don't know if it was a heart attack or a stroke or what, but he suddenly dies. Well, he was fixing to go to Europe. He and Lillian were about to board a ocean liner and go to Europe, and he was going to give a couple talks at conferences. So he dies. A week later, Lillian gets on the boat, goes to Europe, gives the presentations in his stead. She comes back home, and all of those contracts they had with the companies evaporated. Because what does a woman know about business?
Wow.
So Lillian says, all right, short version. She says, all right, you think a woman belongs in the home, in the kitchen? Fine. She ends up doing work for General Electric, who was and still is a major appliance manufacturer.
I can see where this is going.
So her goal is to make our kitchens much more efficient. The pedal trash can, that's attributed to her. all in the name of efficiency. Now we talk about it in terms of hygiene because then you're not putting your grimy hands on but that wasn't what it was about.
That wasn't
It
the
was about if you're
progenitor of
holding-
that idea, no.
No, is if you're holding something, well, if you're going to lift the lid off, you got to put whatever it is down and lift off the lid, and then you throw. Well, no, just step on the pedal and the lid comes up and throw it away. Much more efficient. The shelving in refrigerator doors, that's credited to her. Another thing in the name of efficiency.
Yeah.
If you're always having to dig in the back,
You'll never get it. You'll
ketchup,
never find it, will you?
Exactly.
So those most
So now-
commonly used things make them visible, make them easy to get to.
Exactly.
Yeah, which is why all the things rot in the crispers down below, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, that's where you should
exactly
put your
right.
wine and your cigarettes and other sinful products, ladies and gentlemen.
The fridge butter compartment, that was her. If your fridge, maybe growing up, maybe your grandma's fridge had an egg compartment.
Yep.
That was Lillian Gilbreth. The L-shaped counter in our kitchen, that was her. In fact, that there's any counter at all is really Lillian Gilbreth.
Yeah, like the islands.
Yeah, well, just the level counter. Before Gilbreth got a hold of our kitchens, everything was standalone furniture. If you go to an antique shop and you look at antique kitchen furniture from the early 1900s, late 1800s, everything is its own independent piece of furniture.
Yeah, it's not really flowing with anything else.
No, it's just here. It's just sitting over here being an independent piece of furniture. And that was considered an efficiency kitchen at the time.
Wow.
Well, Gilbreth comes in and says, well, no, we should have a level countertop and it should be this height. She spent a lot of time measuring women, thousands of women.
Yeah,
to
what's the
find
average
out
height and arm length? Yeah.
ergonomically where to put it. She had actually told GE, make your stoves, your ranges adjustable. Because if you got a woman who's really tall, it should be higher. If she's really short, and of course, this is all about women. This is the 1930s.
Sure.
It should be a lot lower. And GE said, "Yeah, no, we can't do that. So we're just going to go with what
Standard
we think.
height. Yeah.
Yeah, standard height. The triangular placement of the fridge, the sink, and the stove. That was Lillian Gilbreth. She determined that through her research by watching women work in the kitchen, that would be the most efficient, and her research
A route to
supported
take,
that.
right? Yeah.
Yep.
So if you're not getting
And-
those 10,000 steps in, ladies and gentlemen, we can blame Gilbreth.
That's exactly right. In fact, she said that triangle the perimeter should be no more than 26 feet.
How about that?
And when I read that, the first thing I did was go and measure ours, and it came in at 23 feet.
Is
Thank
that
you very
right?
much.
How about that? Yeah. And so sometimes
now-
what's aesthetic really is what's best, right? I mean, I know that we we look back on the philosophy of aesthetics and kind of laugh sometimes, maybe even scoff at it, but there is something in beauty, particularly in nature, right? There's probably a math to what we find most beautiful. It's not just completely subjective.
Yep.
There's a value.
So now I tell the story about 'cause this all started with who influenced me the most.
Yes.
And I now start my intro psych class with Lillian Gilbreth. Because so many students, as you know, come into the intro psych course thinking it's all clinical and counseling
It's all
psychology.
Freud. It's all Wundt. Maybe it's Skinner. Yeah.
Maybe. Yeah. So I now lead with Lillian Gilbreth. And I had a student, I taught an online class back in spring 2023.
Okay.
And I asked my students, it was their weekly discussion board. I asked them to do a number of things, one of which was pull something out of the book that you found really interesting and share that with us.
Yes.
And one of my students wrote, I thoroughly enjoyed reading all of chapter 1.4, which is the section in our textbook that talked about Lillian Gilbreth, as well as a few others. She wrote, I like learning about the history of psychology and who played a significant role in shaping the world we live in today.
Oh, my.
Now, I don't know about you, Jason.
I have never
in
heard
30 years
anyone say, I appreciate the history of psychology. No.
I hadn't either. 30
That's
years of
awesome.
teaching, and I had never heard that. All right. Then she said the part about Lillian Gilbreth was fascinating to me. She seemed, and I do have permission from the student to share this.
Okay.
The part about Lillian Gilbreth was fascinating to me. She seemed like such a strong, intelligent woman, and I would love to know more about her story. I can't imagine how hard it would be to first go through with getting a PhD and to top it off, be 9 months pregnant. Now, in Gilbreth's defense, she was frequently 9 months pregnant.
Okay.
She and Frank had 12 children.
Wow. Wow.
But then to face the adversity of being told as a woman you didn't have anything to offer, even with such a prestigious education and brilliant mind. However, that didn't stop her. She just found a new way to help the world around her in ways that impacted and lasted throughout the years, which I thought was inspiring. When I think of psychology, I feel like my mind narrows to only a few select things, and we know what those are.
Yeah.
But getting to hear about her story and the others in that section of the chapter, which include Kenneth and Mamie Clark and William Marston,
Yep.
as well as Wilhelm Wundt,
Mhm.
opened my eyes to see how much psychology is everywhere in the world. I never would have thought that when I opened my fridge butter that a psychologist invented that, which is pretty neat.
That is fantastic. Wow.
So to start intro psych with
Yeah.
a student who is now looking at her kitchen and thinking about psychology. And I like to think that every time she walks into her kitchen, and
She's thinking
listeners,
about
every
that.
time you walk into your kitchen, you're going to think about psychology. And
yeah, that's the power of storytelling, isn't it? And it's the power of turning things upside down. But I think more than either of those two, it's maybe the power of what decolonizing psychology and maybe all science is really about at its heart. You know, is it's not all about straight white men in their middle ages.
yeah. Yep.
That's fantastic. Well, I think I know the answer to a question I actually kind of scrolled over earlier. I was going to ask you if you could wave a magic wand and add one subject or one topic or one story to all introductory psych books, right? You just automatically get carte blanche with respect to editing. They can go in all the psych books. What would it be?
Well, actually, it has nothing to do with Lillian Gilbreth.
Okay.
You know, I would have said at one point human factors.
Mm-hmm.
Just
Because that
that's-
stuff's always in the appendix, if that, and that's always for an
Yeah.
unabridged, like $200 book. You may get a little appendix on IO psychology. Yes.
Yeah, and in fact, the IO division of APA, they actually wrote a small chapter specifically, and they said it's publicly available. Everyone can use it.
Okay.
If you teach intro psych and you want to incorporate it, check out the IO
Nice.
division.
Yeah, that's a great
and-
recommendation.
And you can include that.
Yeah.
I would have said that, and I am still a fan of that. But I think what needs to go in ahead of that is health psychology.
Okay.
So much, when we look at the diseases that are most likely to kill us, so many of them are tied to behavior.
Yeah, definitely preventable.
Between nutrition and exercise, which at their root it's psychology.
Yeah.
It's we already know what good nutrition looks like. Most
Yep,
of us do.
yeah.
We already know that we should exercise more. We already get that. We all make New Year's resolutions.
But the psychology behind all of that, right, can really make
But
a difference,
actually
can it?
doing it.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, actually doing it, that's all psychology.
That's fantastic.
So I think health psychology should absolutely be in there.
Now, would you take anything out to make space for it? Or maybe give something a little less of the spotlight? Do you feel like there's anything in your standard intro text that kind of they overdo?
The three things that we need to sort out is intelligence, language, and motivation.
Okay.
There was Aaron Richmond and several colleagues did a survey of intro psych instructors a couple years ago, 3 years ago now, and they asked that. So, what do you teach? Here's sort of the standard chapters. What do you teach and what don't you teach? And language was taught by only 41% of instructors. Intelligence and motivation was taught by about 2/3, which I thought was higher than what I would expect.
I would think, yeah.
I'm working on revising my intro psych textbook right now, and
is that an open
intelligence-
source?
It's
for
not
my
open
audience,
source.
tell us about
Yeah,
that
no,
one. That's the one you have with.
it's
Is it just
Flat
you or the
World.
author on it, or is it Charles
Yeah.
Stanger and?
Yeah, Charles Stanger.
Mhm.
So the book was originally his,
Okay.
and he retired from University of Maryland, and the publisher, Flat World, was basically saying, "Come on, Chuck, let's do another edition."
see.
And he's like, "Yeah, I don't want to. I'm retired.
Okay.
Just, leave me alone."
Mm.
So, long story short, it's a whole other podcast how I came in,
You kept it going.
but I was invited to come in as junior author,
Mm-hmm.
and I did all the revisions. That book was published 2023, January
Mm-hmm.
2023. And it's doing really well.
Yeah.
And there's a big piece in there about Lillian Gilbreth, for example. So
I'll make
we
sure I
just
link that
started-
on the podcast so people can take a look at
Please.
that. Yeah, review that.
Please do.
Absolutely.
So the book is not open source, but it is affordable. It's $35.95.
Oh, that's as close to open source as you need right there. That's great.
And that's ebook access, and that access is good for a full calendar year.
Okay.
So if you have a student who had to drop out in
Sure.
the fall and they retake in the spring,
they
they
could
still
pick it
have
up in the next
access to the
semester,
book. Yeah. And if students want a print copy, it's print on demand. They just hit the print button, and for an extra $25, they have their own copy to keep
Okay.
in perpetuity.
Okay.
And because the book is ebook first, it's fully customizable.
Mm-hmm.
So, Jason, you can go in and you can add that IO chapter.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You can take out the section on intelligence. You can add a paragraph, add your own videos, swap out from the videos that I have. So it truly fully is customizable.
So,
Anyway.
ladies and gentlemen, she's not just a flexible instructor. She's also a flexible author.
So all of that started because I just started revisions on that book for the next edition. And the intelligence chapter, I've got a colleague here at New Mexico State who's a strong intelligence researcher,
Mhm.
and I'm going to pick his brain about what really needs to be in there. It's a difficult topic.
Yeah.
It's largely about measurement. There are a whole host of issues that go with that. I think it's going to be important, but I don't think a lot of instructors are comfortable teaching that content. And they're making decisions. They're saying, okay, I can't teach all of this content anyway.
Right.
So what can I remove? Same thing with language. I don't think a lot of instructors understand why language is in an intro psych textbook, and therefore they're choosing not to cover it.
Yeah.
One thing I'm planning on doing on the revision is talking more about the psychological benefits of being bilingual or trilingual or multilingual.
Some of those real practical things that everybody can appreciate. Yeah.
Exactly. So so right now I would take that content out, but I'm not going to.
Yeah.
Because the book is fully customizable.
yeah,
You can take it out
right,
if you want it in there.
Well, I was going to ask about your future projects or any goals you've got on the burner. Obviously, revising this textbook. I hear through the grapevine you're also an animal lover. Got some pups. What's on the horizon for Sue Frantz? Anything new or
Largely-
more the same? Or
I'm writing a lot. So my social psych textbook, also same deal. It was Charles Stanger's book. I came in as junior author. I handled all the revisions. So that book is going to publish later this year, probably September.
Okay.
So I'm pretty excited about that. We're about to turn in our manuscript for the next edition of the teaching psychology book, which is Doug Bernstein initially wrote that with Sandy Goss Lucas, and he wanted to take it into a third edition. And Sandy said, I'm retired.
Yep. Really
So-
retired.
Really retired.
Yeah.
So Doug invited me and Steve Chu to come in on that.
Yeah, since you're
So-
retired, Sue, I mean, should be easy, right?
Yeah, retired. It occurred to me at some point that I'm not retired. I am differently employed.
That's right. Yeah, we've got to come up with a new word for it.
Yeah, no,
That's retirement.
I'm retired from full-time teaching. That's what I'm retired from. Linda Wolf and I are working on a book proposal for a critical thinking and decision-making book.
Wow.
A lot of the critical thinking books that are out there are really based on philosophy and
Sure.
its logical fallacies and arguments. And like,
There's more to it.
yeah,
We've
but
got
there's
biases and
so much more. Yeah. So we'll be talking about cognitive biases. We're
excellent.
going to talk about group decision making. So that's going to be a fun project. As you know, I've got the Macmillan blog, which is on teaching psychology.
And that's available to anyone. You don't have to actually be an adopter of Macmillan books or ancillaries, right? And
Yep, no,
anyone
that's
who can
really
get on the
available.
internet can read your blog, right? And I do highly recommend that. That's one of the most fun things that I have read that Sue authors. Not that her textbooks aren't great, but something that I can grab sort of like a breakfast bar in the morning, and within an hour, by the time I'm in class, I can use something that you've mentioned in your blog and sort of run with it during the class. These are more
awesome.
bite-sized. I love them.
That's awesome.
And is there a name for it, Sue? If people wanted to Google your blog with Macmillan, I forget how I've got it
there isn't
bookmarked.
there isn't really a name for it, but if you Google Sue Frantz, Frantz, Macmillan Communities Psychology,
Yeah.
I'm sure it'll be the first thing that pops up.
Okay. Excellent.
And then the last thing I have, because like I said, I'm differently employed, is in 2025, I will be the interim executive director for the Society for the Teaching of Psychology.
Well, congratulations.
Thanks.
And any new initiatives with that organization that you're going to be spearheading?
What I love about this particular position is that I don't spearhead anything.
Okay.
I served on the executive committee for 8 years, both as vice president for resources and as president.
Okay.
And plenty of initiatives there.
Yeah.
The organization has so many excellent people who are working on committees and are directors of things. And my job is to help them
support
with whatever they need for their
Excellent.
initiatives. So I'm enjoying sitting back here and helping them rather than out in front spearheading.
That's great. Well, Sue, any questions you have for me or anything else you want to end with today before I let you go?
What I would say, the one question that we didn't get to that you had shared with me is, what's the secret to my teaching longevity?
Yeah, let's do that.
And I would say a strong support system. My wife calls it the psychosphere.
Oh, wow. I like that.
So I've got a ton of friends from mostly the US and Canada, but plenty in Australia who are my lifeline. And I can text any of them, email any of them at any time, and they keep me out of trouble, basically.
Yeah.
They will tell me when I'm about to make a mistake. They tell me when I have made a mistake, and then they help me dig out of the hole
course correct.
that I created for myself. Yeah.
That's awesome.
So having a strong group of people around you, people who will be honest with you, is just invaluable.
Well, I hope that you know you've got another one right here on the East Coast in beautiful coastal Wilmington, North Carolina, Sue. Ladies and gentlemen, couch surfers, you've been listening to an interview about why we love psychology so much with master teacher Sue Frantz. Sue, I really do appreciate your time today, and I look forward to talking to you again in the very near future.
Thank you, Jason. Anytime.
There it is. You see, you're a barbarian and you after all. Now, you don't get away that easy. Picture of Uncle Walt up there. What does he remind you of? Don't think. Answer. Go on. A madman. What kind of madman? Well, think about it. Just answer again. A crazy madman. Oh, you can do better than that. Free up your mind. Use your imagination. Say the first thing that pops into your head, even if it's total gibberish. Go on. A sweaty tooth madman. Good God, boy, there's a poet in you after all.